17 September, 1812. How confusing it must have been, Uncle, for the Imperial Guard to finally enter this grand city and be greeted by no one. No delegation of supplicants, no formal presentation of surrender. It's now been realized that the Russians' plan was to evacuate every citizen who could walk or crawl, and the place was inhabited upon our arrival only by the wounded, the weak, the derelict, the orphaned. As the very first night fell, fires broke out everywhere. Remnants of Kutuzov's army are attempting to leave Bonaparte with nothing to claim as victor. Immediately 400 men, including some from the 13th Infantry, were organized into a primitive fire brigade, but by midnight the sky was orange and crimson with the flames. There was no direction one could look without seeing densely arranged buildings wilting under the inferno. Bonaparte himself was forced to move his headquarters from the Kremlin into a ruined palace on the St. Petersburg road. De Beauharnais led the 13th and 14th beyond the city limits as well, and we watched the burning from afar for 2 whole days. The rains did finally come, and applied the salve we could not, but when it was judged safe enough for us to re-enter the city, it became quickly clear that everything ever built inside it would continue to burn. The looting began immediately. Soldiers and scurrying partisans alike dismantle this proud place recklessly and with much violence. The men have been forced to billet wherever they can, making command more difficult. Contendant's orders to us contradict themselves, and he seems flummoxed. No one seems to know what comes next. The men of the 92nd and 106th Line have been allowed to spread out in the northwest sector. Most believe Bonaparte will not leave this city without demanding terms from Alexander, which means we must hunker down and wait for that message of capitulation to come. The Russian retreat was so hasty that substantial caches of grain, vegetables, and potable water were left behind. But how long they will last, we cannot be sure. 21st September. The billet Contendant selected for the 92nd is an Orthodox church at the end of a muddy lane. I awoke last night to a terrible sound. Meffre, the young private with unkempt red hair, was also awake, but he has not seemed to shut his eyes once since battle shock struck him in the trench at Borodino. The sight of an iron ball shrieking towards him from an artillery battery, missing his face by inches, was apparently more than his fevered mind could stand. Since then he has been more liability than asset. He was sitting upright on a pew and staring out one of the broken stained glass windows. The sound was like the roar of some great raging animal in the last throes of life. One could envision it growling with daunting anger, then tilting its head back to release a more guttural cry that echoed through the cobblestones and the stone ruins. Again and again it came, from somewhere beyond the lane. Meffre seemed to be in a state of mesmerism. The light-hearted fool, Claudon, woke as well. The cries faded away, leaving only the low rumble of the flames that slowly consume some sort of factory several blocks to the west. "Do you know that sound?" I asked Meffre, and after some rumination he replied, "It is a horse." "Well then," I suggested, "perhaps one of us should go out there and end its considerable misery." "It is not dying," came the affrighted reply. "It has gone mad." Of course, why should it be otherwise? The lack of food and care, the noxious fires blotting out the sky, the sounds of battle spanning weeks, and finally, utter abandonment. Why should every beast in this unfortunate country not have gone utterly insane? I tried to fall back asleep, but each night now brings perhaps 2 hours of real rest. In the morning we continued our searches, building to building, for food and supplies. Some of the men provide aid to the more desperate Russian families when they can, but there is so little to share. Others simply mock them and have lost all pity. The fires around the city have created a persistent cloud of soot which hangs in the air and impairs one's field of vision. Contandin may join some of us up with the Polish sappers in their attempts to arrest the Russian arsonists. They maneuver in the shadows all around the city, hiding in attics, storefronts, inside tombs. More than 100 have already been captured and shot. 24 September. The gnawing ache in my stomach is only in part born of hunger. I have heard a chilling rumor. I must remind myself that sources within the regiment are not always to be trusted. But it is Varsenot's understanding that we are to remain in Moscow for as long as it takes to receive word from Alexander of his surrender. But it is becoming late September, and the weather even now is turning. It takes only venturing beyond the canal, as I have done on maneuvers, to feel the snap in the air, which means that the snows are coming. Broussard believes that from the moment we passed through the city gates, we had but 1 week to reverse course and commence a return to Smolensk ahead of winter. Surely Bonaparte must understand this. No one else seems to feel the fear that I do, the certainty that a terrible mistake is being made. I look for it in their eyes, but the men seem so detached. Perhaps the accumulation of battle fatigue has dampened what they feel. Before evening fell came word that Corporal Vitrel's life had been ended by a sniper's bullet. I and Varsenot and Meffre were sent to retrieve him. He lay face down on the steps of a library. There had been almost no blood. The silent buildings around us told us nothing of his vanished assassin. Varsenot stayed behind on guard, while Meffre and I employed a mule to carry Vitrel, as we searched for a dignified place for burial. We cannot wait for the carts to move the dead into the fields beyond the canal. The fires have made the area so warm that decomposition will set in too quickly. The space chosen for burial, on a settlement beside the Kimka River, was once a wheelwright's shop. It is dark and small, but clean, a perfect square. The floor is only bare earth, and with some effort a grave was dug. One day when the space is reclaimed, it is probable that no one will ever know a French soldier rests here. 27 September. The days consist of transporting every conceivable scrap of supply for either an eventual march or a long hibernation within the city. We relentlessly interrogate locals about what they might be concealing, and there are ever more fruitless efforts to contain the fires. At 8:30 last night, just as I was given some rice and lentils for the evening meal, I heard a commotion from the street outside the church and followed some men from the 7th Foot Battery to a spot 2 blocks over. There had been a gruesome discovery. A group was surrounding a dead Westphalian who was still upright. He was a lance corporal, terribly bent backward at the waist over the windowsill of an abandoned tenement, his upper half having been smashed through a wide pane of glass, while his feet remained firmly on the stones beneath him. No one seemed to want to touch him, but finally his upper half was pulled out of the shadows. His right cheek had been torn open. There were several shallow gouges and bites on his chest, but his death seemed to have come as a result of great impact from something unknown. The wooden planks had been demolished in many places all around him, driving his broken legs deeper into the foundation. His waist was misshapen and compressed in grisly fashion. The glass from the shattered window had fallen entirely into the tenement. It was as if he had been struck by a runaway cart that had withdrawn and vanished. I saw a young boy watching us with a strange grin on his dirty face. Contandin told him to come forward, and he bounded over as if expecting us to engage in play. Contendin barked at him in his erratic Russian if he had seen what happened here. The boy lowered himself immediately to his hands and knees on the cobblestones and kicked his little legs out again and again, in imitation of something far bigger than he was, moving his head up and down, then shaking it extravagantly. He made not a sound. Perhaps he was a mute, perhaps feeble. Contendin shooed him away, and the boy ran with a curious joviality down the block. 2 men from the 7th dragged the corporal away. There was an odd smell in the window, dank and foul. I returned to the church. Each day the men commit some new and petty act of vandalism against it, defacing icons, toppling statues. Again I awoke in the night, but not for any reason I understood. All around me, the remnants of the 92nd line slept uneasily, stretched out on pews or even across the altar. I saw Meffra sitting in a corner of the church, gazing once again at the muddy red sky beyond the windows. His left hand was clasped around a chunk of round shot he stole from a reserve artillery unit. He has taken to carrying this talisman with him wherever he goes, even to meals and the latrine. 30 September. I know that there have been desertions since we arrived because the men speak of them, but I cannot tell where the deserters have gone and what exactly drove them. My first and most commanding thought is that they, like me, are watching the sky and know more about the weather in the region than I, and realize the danger we are in by staying. This afternoon I saw Muriel cataloging a cache of short sabers uncovered at the university. Muriel is my only connection to reliable information, as he speaks often with Contendin. And so I asked him outright what he has heard. Bonaparte, he told me, has received no reply to his messages to Alexander. Not a word. And so we continue to wait. We cannot move on to St. Petersburg, as Kutuzov still has troops waiting for us in that direction, and the path is epidemic with partisans. To the southeast, the Russian forces are said to be regrouping. We will stay until Alexander gives in. But what if he doesn't? I asked. What if he's merely toying with the emperor, knowing he's brought the entire army into a fatal dead end? Why should Alexander acquiesce when he knows we'll starve here? Muriel regarded me cruelly, losing patience. The emperor, he said, has studied in great detail the geography around us, so all we can do is trust in him. But I do not trust him. God help me, I do not trust Bonaparte, who is not the man he once was at the height of his power. I trust mathematics. Each day grows shorter and the temperatures fall. Behind us, from Smolensk to the Neman River, the Russians have utterly stripped the land, and there will be nothing for us or the pack animals to eat for weeks, returning to Prussia or even pushing into the Ukraine. As for shelter, I can think of few structures I saw on the march after Borodino that had not already been raised to thwart us. In the mud of late summer, the supply trains became stuck. In the snow and ice, they will become buried. The horses will first stop pulling our burdens, and then perish. Muriel ordered me away from him. I will not approach him again. Sunset was at 6:15. It has been almost 13 days since we claimed Moscow. Yesterday was my 22nd birthday. 2nd October. After 9 hours of fruitless maneuvers and tedious sentry duty on a perimeter strung across the city's north edge, the 92nd marched back to its heart in the early evening. The column broke down, and we all began our nightly ritual of going to wherever the next meal was. In this case, a cup of fish stew, bread, and weak tea. As I took my portion to the steps of the music conservatory, where a dozen other men ate and dozed, we all heard shouting. Contadin was running towards us down the street, cursing, spouting angry tears, supporting his left hand with the right. Blood coursed over his wrist. He had been bitten, unprovoked, by a horse which had come out of nowhere and charged him. The wound was quite terrible. 2 medics emerged immediately to tend to him. He exhorted the nearest soldiers to kill the beast and pointed uncertainly to the south, then sank to his knees and lay supine on the cold stones beneath him. A stupor has clouded the men, and only 4 of us committed to action, while all the others on the street had chewed their bread and stared listlessly. Myself, Varsenot, a private named Guillaume, and finally, at Contadin's order, Meffre, once the sharpest shot among us. I knew that was a mistake. We others took our rifles as well. Immediately we heard a shout coming from behind a row of abandoned tenements that had slowly burned out. We hurried in that direction. This sector was grim and still choked by sporadic flames. Where one fire had died, another had taken its place. It was likely that Contadin had been haunting places and situations he should not have. We found ourselves on a street of prostitutes and addicts. People stood idly on corners, huddled against buildings, having given up hope even before the city was abandoned. Several destitute families emerged from their hovels to watch the commotion as we passed. Then I saw it. A gray horse, galloping on the main avenue that leads to an old hospital. It was an imposing beast, and its hooves could be heard smacking the stones from 50 meters away. It ran from our left to our right, and disappeared behind a block of public baths. We all twisted our faces and bodies slowly to follow its progress. It appeared once again, turning down Petrovska Street. The tall flames, yearning up from a ruined theater, lit it uncannily as it galloped, without rider or harness. The throng on the street watched it silently, transfixed by this aberration. Sure enough, after disappearing behind a clock tower, leaving us with only the ghost of its footfalls, it emerged again to make yet another right-hand turn, now behind us. Down Strasnov it cantered at great speed, passing close enough to the somber buildings to cause an old man and woman to press themselves back into a doorway. It seemed only a matter of moments before the holes and cracks in the decrepit road caused the great horse to stumble, but it possessed a singular knack for avoiding any impedance. All shouting had stopped, and there were only wordless spectators, myself included. Varsenot pointed, and I saw that the horse's left flank was afflicted with a jutting arrow, a full 20 centimeters of wood emerging from a wound of the recent past. Someone yelled at Meffre to shoot the creature down. He took to steadying his rifle, but we saw with utter shock that he did not relinquish his hold on the chunk of round shot he has been gripping tightly for these many days, and was attempting to steady his aim while wrestling with this extraordinary handicap. I shouted at him to drop the object, but he was focused entirely on his task. He discharged one blast at the animal, which had turned a final corner and begun to conclude the square it had drawn all around us, splashing through elongated puddles of mud and oil. The shot missed, harmlessly ripping away a chunk of brickwork. Meffre tried again, shooting virtually one-handed. The second bullet vanished into the air, punctuating his rare failure. I strode up to him and tore the rifle from his hands in disgust. The horse streaked off to the north, putting more distance between itself and our woeful contingent, darting into a dark alleyway barely wider than its body. It then vanished. Quickly, its footfalls were no more. Meffre's face was slack as I and Varsenot cursed him. If reports of his brain fever catch the attention of Contadin, I fear he will be doomed to court-martial." His eyes were watery, bloodshot. He sat down heavily on the street, mentally adrift, dangerously emaciated, barely a soldier anymore. "You cannot kill that horse," I heard a voice say behind me in labored French, and I turned to see a Russian girl of perhaps 18, standing beside what must have been her mother and much younger brother. She was filthy and disheveled, but her long blonde hair had suffered no ill effect from her hunger. She wore a crudely fashioned medal of the Virgin Mary around her neck. There was a bright and vivid hatred in her eyes. "You have created a demon," she said. "You are to blame." I felt myself withering under her stare, and am ashamed now that I felt the need to defend myself to this urchin. "It is war, miss, that has done this," I said to her crossly, "and you'll be wise to keep silent before you insult my country." She shook her head, unmoved by my argument. "It will come again," she warned, "for all of you. And I pray it takes more lives than you can imagine." At first I thought she spoke of war. Of war. "Do you see how this might have been, uncle?" But upon thinking more on her words, I believe she did allude to the crazed horse that had drawn a strangely threatening square around us before making away. We could not stay and entertain this girl's curses. We withdrew. I saw Mefra walking away down the avenue alone. "Why does he cling to that round shot?" I asked Guillaume later as we shared a flask before first light. "It is because," Guillaume explained to me, "he believes, as long as it is not inside a cannon, it cannot be shot into his head." 4th October. Light snow fell on the city today. A regimental inspection had been commanded at dawn, the third since we arrived in Moscow. The men all across the city collected themselves for presentation to the officers. In the old church, we were aware immediately that many men were missing. No one acted to locate them. Among the absent was Private Mefra, who has not been seen since the night of his failure to bring down the furious gray horse. Another deserter. Some, I've been told, have headed southeast to willingly surrender to Kutuzov in the event of a counterattack. Murel was to bear the brunt of the responsibility for the depletion. But Contandin was not present to inspect the men. Word went around that the bite he suffered had brought him a severe infection. I worked for hours preparing food in the hospital ward set up on Boulevard Petrovsky, where 300 men are interned. I was exhausted by the time I returned to the church and ate something, intent only on the brief balm of tobacco. It was around 11 that I was shaken awake by Murel, who quietly ordered myself and another private to follow him outside. He instructed us to leave our rifles behind. We left the sleeping men, and once on the street, Murel asked in a careful voice what knowledge I had of a secure burying place where Vitrel had been laid to rest. I told him of the wheelwright shop near the Kimka, and he bade us walk with him. As we followed, he demanded that we were to tell no one of what we saw when we reached our destination. At length, we entered a building that marked it as a home for the insane. In an airy room down an arched passageway, a doctor sat beside a bed on which lay Contandin, stripped to the waist. He was dead. His right arm was colored in red and black from hand to shoulder, and had swollen to twice its normal size. His eyes were open, and his head was tilted towards us as if he were expecting us to arrive. His heart had given out quite suddenly, Muriel told us. He ordered the boy-faced private and myself to take the body away and bury it respectfully in the wheelwright's shop. We were to pile him into a cart and take him through back streets so as not to attract undue attention. The doctor helped us cover the body with sheets, and we went out into the night again, pulling the cart through an inch of snow. The private, Oiseau by name, looked morose and fearful of snipers, though these have now been expunged. The streets were at their loneliest. No one watched our progress. We brought Contandin into the shop where Vitrel had been laid to rest. The earth had since grown cold, and it made digging much harder. It was well past 1 o'clock when we finally placed our charge into his shallow grave by the light of the lantern. First, Oiseau reminded me to remove the sheets that held our superior. They would have use for the regiment with the onset of the cold weather. Doing so exposed his anguished face, if ever so briefly. One of his eyes bulged eccentrically. Before we completed the process of interring the body, Oiseau asked for a short respite. He offered me a measure of brandy, which I accepted gratefully. I had barely taken it from him when there came from behind us a loud thudding sound, so sudden and violent I dropped the flask from my hand. The center of the wooden door we had closed against the wind an hour earlier splintered with a long vertical crack as a great weight collided against it. Oiseau's eyes went wide. We did not know if we should approach the door or retreat to the corner of our small enclosure. I shouted at Oiseau to hand me the lantern as I kept close to the window. The door was struck a second time, and shards of pine flew inward and settled upon the earth. The vertical crack split wide enough to let cold air into the room. A mass protruded into it at eye level, then withdrew. We heard the grunting of an animal. I held the lantern aloft just as the beast's snout disappeared from view. Now, with the door breaking apart, we could better discern from outside the sound of hooves maneuvering on stone. We remained rooted in place, possessing no comprehension of the spectacle before us. For a moment there was silence. Then Oiseau saw before I did the shadow that emerged at the window, and he recoiled before the thick glass exploded inward. A shard of it sliced across my forehead. We avoided injury from the rest. The upper body of the gray horse crashed through the window, its lower half impeded by the wooden foundation. The horse coughed and sputtered and twisted its head left and right, snapping at me. I staggered backwards. Oiseau had collapsed to his knees, arms over his head protectively. I swung the lantern, and it made contact with the horse's head, breaking. There was a tiny explosion of light, which made its feral eyes glimmer, and in the next instant there was only darkness. The horse cried out and pulled back, but then it hoisted itself up so that its front legs clamped the window-sill, and it began to push inward, attempting again to climb into the room, to get at us. I yelled at Oiseau to run. He escaped out the side door and into a fetid hallway leading to the rear exit. I felt in the dark for the shovel with which we had buried Contandin. The horse clambered over the windowsill clumsily, its back hooves scraping it as it began to snort and scream in the way I'd heard it many nights before from the church on Berzarina Street. I smelled decay on its neglected body and its breath as its weight struck the floor hard, and it struggled to rise like a ship that had gone aground. Bits of glass likely embedded themselves in its hide. I could see the silhouette of the arrow that had lodged in its left flank. I frantically swung the head of the shovel at the strong neck that was exposed to me, hitting the horse with the tool's flat side. It released a bizarre, wet bark and lunged at me. I sidestepped, turned, and stumbled the way Oiseau had gone. Upon reaching the door, I spun and slammed it behind me, then felt my way down the corridor blindly and pushed on the exit leading into the alley. Oiseau was there. We ran between buildings and down the avenue. We were not followed. We made our way back to the church without a word, spending some time outside of it, settling ourselves completely before entering again. "I'll get my rifle," Wazo said, "and keep watch, and if it comes, I'll kill the cursed thing." I waited with him for another half hour, but there were no disturbances on the street. No shadows lengthened. No hooves were heard to clack on stone. It might all have been nothing but a dream, save for the blood that had smeared my forehead and trickled down into my eyes. Images of this place intrude and swarm, cluttering my mind, and I transcribe them only in the hope that if my life ends out on the plain, these pages will be found and someone will at least know my name and connect me to a time and place. 17 nights after first entering this city, I walk the streets without aim, counter to my orders. Discipline concerns me not at all anymore. I have seen men of the regiment start fires for reasons they cannot even express, driven by tedium and anger. Towers burn. The trees of a cemetery were swallowed in flames. I have seen impoverished children playing on an overturned cannon, pretending it is a great black bird on whose back they soar. A soldier stood in a public park where vultures now amass, daring men one by one to strike him as hard as they could until he finally collapsed, bleeding and laughing. A broken carriage with its doors encrusted with jewels floated on its side down the Moscow River. A naked old man in a long beard riding atop the wreckage. I regarded the abandoned Kremlin from across that same expanse just before dawn, black smoke still curling around its ruins. A pack of wild dogs ran in a column atop the buttress wall. Through the ruined window of the wheelwright shop, jagged glass still clinging to the frame like icicles, I saw, on the very spot where Contandin had been laid to rest, two feminine shapes huddled together to keep warm. They wore the sheets in which we'd delivered him. I looked away when I sensed their faces turn to me. I wondered if they had completed the burial, or dumped the body on the street. I set my pen down now, Uncle, and tell myself I shall not pick it up again until there is something other in the world to experience than this cradle of madness. "Why are we not on the march?" Farsino whispers to me in the dark. "When the snow has already begun to fall, how will we be fed if we stay or if we go?" I do not answer him. I only imagine his name etched faintly on granite, somewhere near my own, in some field far away from the place we were born. 9th October. Yesterday, our exodus southwest toward the city of Kaluga finally began. Formations were organized, supply trains were loaded, schedules and street routes were distributed. Bonaparte has never received terms from Alexander. We approached Moscow as victors, and leave it as victims of a cruel and mocking silence. It rained lightly from dawn till dusk. Just before the first gray light of day colored the windows of the church, I rose among the general commotion, and with my rifle in hand, took to the street, mixing anonymously among hundreds of my countrymen. 3 blocks away, behind a toppled bell tower, I set a path down a quiet street and entered the Cathedral of the Ascension. There was no one inside the place. Pieces of a shattered statue of the Blessed Virgin were strewn in the aisle between the pews. At the rear of the church was a square pine door built into the floor. I pulled it open, releasing a veil of dust into the air. I began to descend a set of crumbling stairs. Before I sealed myself into the place I had noted on a map, scavenged from the university library by Private Wasso, I secured my rifle to my back and lit 2 candles, one for each hand. Only then did I bring the door down upon myself. There were 8 steps in all. I felt a faint funnel of cool air at the level of my neck as I stepped with trepidation into a corridor only an inch taller than I was. I had to bend at the waist so that the point of my rifle would not scrape the ceiling. The candlelight was printed on the stones around me in deep ochre, dampness and age distorting its true color. The catacombs were very small, and the corridor ended just 10 meters or so ahead. Coffins of lead and clay were stacked 3 high against each wall, separated by warped and misshapen wooden shelves. Inside stone chests were the bones of families whose prosperity had given them the special privilege of being interred here. Only once in the 36 hours I cowered in that room did I push aside the stone lids to behold them, both repulsed and fascinated. There I sat, shivering, with only a few lentils and almost no water, passing in and out of consciousness. Sometime around midday, I awoke from a thin sleep to hear the march of footfalls on the street above, as what may have been the final formation left the city. After that, there was silence, except for an occasional shout. Night fell 6 hours ago. I emerged from the catacombs, left the cathedral, and stood under a full moon, the army I had fought for long gone. I would not be missed or searched for. I felt drawn to the plain to the west of the Moscow River, and so I went in that direction, following thousands of footprints and wheel ruts that will soon be covered by the snow. I was fortunate enough to come across an overturned cart on which had been piled rags, sheets, and clothing that had been deloused by the 2nd Reserve Cavalry. 2 Russians were picking through it, paying no mind to me. I wrapped some of the remnants around myself, and when I was done I believed I appeared little like a soldier, though I felt barely warmer for it. To an old woman selling the last of her possessions on the street, I offered my own last coins for a lantern, oil, and cotton, wrapping it all carefully. Beyond the canal, there was an abandoned factory whose west side faced the plain, and I entered it through the open space where a pair of great latticed doors had once stood guard before toppling inward. The factory stretched 3 floors high. Its machinery had long since stopped functioning. Complicated hulks of wood and iron sat useless and in disrepair. It felt as if I had merely entered another dank tomb. The floors were strewn with all manner of detritus. I heard the echo of scurrying rats and the dripping of water through sundry gaps in the walls and eroded pipes. Not a single window was intact. 2 great holes had formed in the high ceiling under the aggregate of snow, wind, and rain. I intended to find a room inside this vast sepulchre and rest, and then, at dawn, I would rise once again with no plan beyond surviving the next day. But as I traversed a corridor which seemed like a route into an assemblage of offices and storerooms, I heard a disturbance somewhere high above. The unmistakable, swift clacking of a horse's hooves across a hard surface, tinged with the reverberation of vast, hollow space. The sound faded, re-emerged, faded again as the unseen beast made its way from one point to another, seeming to neither approach nor depart. I unwrapped the lantern and prepared it. Once aglow, I felt exposed somehow, and at first did not have the fortitude to advance. Then The hooves sounded again, much closer, but still above me. For nearly a quarter of an hour I remained motionless as I listened to its halting and confused progress within the factory's labyrinth of shadows. I attempted to slowly focus on whether it seemed to be trying to descend further, and eventually I judged it had found itself on the ground floor. Spellbound, I went further down the corridor. An intersection presented me with a view down a much longer one. It led back towards the factory's central production space. I set the lantern on the floor and unslung my rifle. I had 3 shots left to me, no more. I heard nothing for a time except the sighing of the wind beyond the factory's walls and that interminable dripping of water. Then the horse I could not see was heard to furiously gallop a marked distance, which could only mean it was crossing the production floor. But I could not grasp how to get there. The hooves stopped once again. I fixed my gaze on the end of the long, thin corridor. The gray beast appeared there and disappeared in an instant, before I could even set my rifle's aim. Still, there was no mistaking it for anything but the demon that had attacked myself and Waso. I saw the arrow still protruding from its side. However, something was strikingly different about the horse now. It carried a sizable weight on its back, whose details I wasn't able to distinguish. The sound of its progress maddeningly faded once again. If I were to go down that long corridor, I feared there would be no way to maneuver out of it in the dreadful event that the horse returned and charged. Whether the rooms to the left and right were sealed and locked, I could not know without exploring further. I looked down at the lantern and wondered whether it was an attractor or repellent to the beast. The sense that it was searching for me felt unassailable. I decided to progress, the lantern in my left hand, the rifle in my right. The rooms all around me were indeed locked tight. I kicked a glass bottle as I moved and cringed at the echo, for there seemed to be causation between it and the sound of the horse repositioning itself far away, perhaps turning. I had committed myself to a path and did not shy from it. The lantern showed me writing in the dust on the wall to my left. My Russian was poor as ever, but I believe the words were ones of infantile hatred towards some long vanquished nation. The end of the corridor opened indirectly onto the production floor. I was back where I had begun. The lantern afforded me a vision only of what lay 5 meters ahead of me. I moved with great deliberation amongst the machinery. Aborted samples of its output were laid out on tables, smooth-bore muskets with flints and lock plates piled in barrels. I had begun to shiver gently and was unable to stop. It caused the lantern to produce the small noise of glass trembling against wood. I finally stopped and remained in one place. And I think perhaps the days of cold and hunger and loneliness had finally rendered me mad, for I believe I sang aloud a snatch of song from my school days, a few halting lines about a father and son setting out on a hunt on the first day of the season, my voice feeble with exhaustion, mangling the simple melody. The light of the lantern had held steady on a tall machine shrouded by gauzy, moth-eaten linen, and now, what I believed to have been merely a knob or dial jutting out from that intricate mass was clearly a filmy, gawking eye, part of a hulk that had been standing there all along, watching me, calculating. I heard the horse's breath then, labored and sick. I dropped the lantern and the horse bucked, its entire body visible as yellow light sprayed outward and then died just as quickly. In raising my rifle, it discharged. There was another flash of light as a bullet left the chamber. Instead of attacking me, the gray horse wailed, twisted, and fled directly for the open gap in the side of the building. Before it became little more than a black phantom silhouetted against the plain, I saw more closely the burden it carried on its back. It was Private Mefra, whose stare was hollow and dull-witted, and who swooned and almost toppled over, having no agency over his own limbs. He had lashed himself to the beast's neck and a midsection with multiple coils of rope. The horse was unable to shake this dying transient. I realized what I would do at once. I bolted for the stairwell that would bring me to the second and then the third floor of the factory, charging recklessly up the steps in the dark. A corridor no more than 3 meters wide spanned the length of the place high above, and panting like the animal that had confronted me, I ran for one of the dozen broken windows through which the moonlight fell. It was so much colder up there with the wind blowing in that my teeth chattered uncontrollably. The gray horse galloped through the falling snow onto the plain that stretched into the blackness where the Emperor's army had marched hours before, and then it suddenly stopped, perhaps feeling it had safely escaped danger, or perhaps gathering the will for a malevolent return. Puppet-like and possessing no strength, Mefra merely clung to his new master's reins. Perhaps he had hoped it would protect him from death, but he was too far gone. The horse's full length was presented to my aim. I pointed the rifle through the window gap, and to steady my rebellious hands, rested the barrel gently on a jutting V created by the pattern of shards of broken glass. My breath curled before me. Seconds before I fired, another shadow appeared out there. Someone was walking through the snow, having no coat for protection against the cold, attempting to slowly approach the horse. Her hands remained low at her sides, her palms upward in a gesture of humility, as if presenting alms. It was the young Russian girl who had spoken curses at me. The horse eyed her apprehensively, yet it allowed her ever closer. Step by careful step, she approached it in a way no one had found the grace to attempt. But if she hoped to tame it with her good will, she knew less of life and locked hearts than even I. When she got within arm's length of the horse, its head convulsed in the spasmodic, afflicted manner I'd seen before. It bucked, and it ran from her into the darkness, carrying Mefra away. Just as I could see the color of her hair in the moonlight, I could see the animal's pain, could sense its angry passion fading. I went out there when it was gone, and took what rags I could off my body and placed them on the girl. She was too depleted now to condemn me. We left the factory, and made our way back to the place she had followed me from. Soon enough, we could walk by the light of the ceaseless fires that had taken her birthplace away from her.